Good evening and welcome to the American Family Association's weekly cable program. The AFA is a national organization devoted to strengthening the American family, the very foundation of our civilization. Tonight's topic is, why are school taxes out of control? And our host is Mike Mulhall.
Good evening. Welcome to the American Family Association Presents. Tonight's show is, why are our school taxes out of control? Property taxes paid by homeowners in New York State suburbs are among the highest in the nation. The largest part are school taxes, which are 60% of property taxes. School taxes have risen far more than county and town taxes. Why? That's tonight's topic. Our guests are Pat Byrne and Frank Russo. Patrick Byrne is the president of Maximus Financial Services in Commack, Long Island. Pat is also president of the Nesconset Sachem Civic Association and was appointed by the Suffolk County Legislature as director of the Suffolk Regional OTB Corp. Pat is a former Democratic candidate for the Suffolk County Legislature and a founding member of Long Islanders for Educational Reform, known as LIFER. Frank Russo is president of the Port Washington Educational Assembly and is a former division manager of Verizon Corp. Frank is the president of the American Family Association in New York and has 7 children and 21 grandchildren. Frank also has 6 teachers in his immediate family, along with Patrick, is a founding member of LIFER. We welcome them both tonight. And now to my co-host, Patty.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Let's start with you, Frank, and then we'll turn to Pat for the same question. What is your view of the main problem with school taxes in the various suburbs in the state?
Well, they are simply out of control, which is the title of the program, and the key evidence of that is one basic measurement. If you just look over the past 25 years, this is a problem that's going on more than 25 years, but just going back 25 years, inflation in the New York metro area is up 140% in the past 25 years. You know what school costs are up? We'd be so lucky if they were up only 140%. They're up 360%. So school costs are going up at enormous rates, far outpacing everything else. And why? It's because basically it's a typical government monopoly, and it's even worse than certain government monopolies are natural monopolies. This is an unnatural monopoly. In other words, we ought to have some competition. They don't have competition, and so they take advantage of the situation. Quality is mediocre, costs are out of control, and it's hurting a lot of people, not only senior citizens, some people just think it's senior citizens, young families, young moms have to go out to work, who would rather stay home with their children. A lot of pressure on ordinary people to pay bills, and it means it takes money away from things that they otherwise would like to spend it on.
Pat, how do you respond to that?
I agree with Frank. It's just a matter of affordability at this point. It's not a matter of trying to hurt a group of teachers. I have a lot of teachers in my family. I am not anti-teacher. I think they do a wonderful job. But, as we all know, the average family income on Long Island is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $80,000. Even looking at the formula that Frank described before, CPI and inflation, that's the cost of living, basically. We're all going to the oil pump right now. We're paying more for gasoline, okay? Now, CPI and inflation doesn't even necessarily mean that people are making more money. It just means that it's more expensive. So if you go out to a person right now who, again, is paying more for gasoline at the pump, and you basically say, hey, you know what, we need you to kick in a little bit more to send down to the state because a teacher or a police officer is having to pay more at the gas pump, you're talking to a person that may not have gotten a raise themselves in 10 years. So inflation is relevant to them, but they're not, their ability to afford things isn't increasing. At some point, I'm in the financial services industry. I'm afraid for everybody that we're going to run out of money. So that's the issue.
It does seem to be heading in a dangerous direction.
We are.
Pat, tell us what got you involved in this issue and how you, as a former Democratic candidate for county legislator, came to meet Frank Russo, a conservative candidate in Nassau County.
I've been asked that before, and I've gotten a little bit of flack over that, actually. As the president of my civic association, I hooked up with a fellow by the name of Fred Gorman, who has probably been single-handedly responsible for me saving about $1,000 a year on my current property taxes. Phenomenal advocate. Fred decided that at some point we should organize all of the civics. Frank was known as the superstar in Nassau County for organizing civics to deal with school budgets, so those two kind of hooked up. I met with him. Now, everybody is wondering, well, a staunch conservative, a Democrat, we have other leadership, Lori Pantelakis, who I believe is a Republican. we're coming together to fight a battle so we could survive on Long Island. And the way that I think Frank and I look at it is, let's make sure we can afford to live here and stay here, and then enjoy some debates about other issues going forward. Because if I'm down in North Carolina, Frank lives in Arizona.
You can't work on anything together.
It doesn't matter. And I've learned a lot from him. He's respectful. And again, we don't necessarily get along on everything, but the ability to talk about issues and have people come together is
Rationally.
what the country's based on.
Frank, and how did you get involved in this issue originally?
Oh, I've been involved in the school budget and school tax issue since the late 1960s when I moved to Long Island in Baldwin, and we had something called the Baldwin Educational Assembly. So we have what's called the Port Washington Educational Assembly in Port Washington. I stole the name from Baldwin. No, the issue is so clear cut. I mean, taxes are a major part of our expenses. The culprits here are, I look at the culprits as threefold, three parties. One is the local school board. Second is Albany, our Albany legislature. And the third, sad to say, is all of us citizens who, by and large, 99.99% do nothing. We don't know what to do. They're too busy working hard, working two jobs to pay their taxes and taking care of their families and tend to problems that people just are not focused on this school tax problem, which is a major part of our course. And now looking at the other two areas, we'll get into maybe school boards and Albany. They each have a major part to play in this grief that lies that we're facing.
Well, to highlight that question now, I mean, that's an excellent point. What is the appropriate role of the school board, and really, what can they do? I mean, what can they do that they're currently not? I mean, in my community down in Long Beach, Point Lookout, there are three terrific individuals who are running, but what can really occur at the school board level? What is the successful person going to communicate to the public and be at the same time respectful to the teachers' unions who are looking for appropriate compensation? Pat?
I think that we need to do a better job teaching the voters and educating the voters. And I think the school boards are going to have to start looking at programs that have been notoriously taboo, medical plans and things like that. Now, again, I am a beneficiary of the public medical system, okay? I don't pay any premiums, okay? Great insurance plan. Now, the problem with that is I don't want to go out and take this benefit away from everybody, but everybody's medical costs are going up in double digits every year, okay? We're also blessed and at the same time cursed with something else going on, and that's increased life expectancy. People are living longer. They're having heart attacks, they're surviving heart attacks. They're surviving cancer. Diabetes is now a problem, but it's chronic. Alzheimer's. So people are going to be around forever. They could live to age 100, and we have to figure out a way to pay for this. Part of what I do is I install medical plans for companies. A lot of my clients come in, pay $1,500 a month for a family plan. It's expensive. It's very, very difficult now to go back out to that person and say, hey, you know, this person isn't paying anything towards their program, and it's going up in cost. We need you to send some extra money into the state to pay for their plan. It's just got to be some degree of equity out there, and there's got to be some understanding as what.
So you think that there's a disconnect between people who work in the private sector, small businesses, and people who go to work?
Absolutely.
Versus people who work in the government sector, or in this case, the school system?
Sure, absolutely. And even the politicians, they were all covered. So, you know, nobody wants to rock the boat. My greatest fear is, again, not to take that away from people, but 20, 30 years from now, our children who are going to be strapped with maybe 90% payroll taxes, they're not going to adjust it. They're going to cut us off. And it is a problem. There are groups out there, Concord Coalition, that look at just the math involved with entitlements, and we got to fix it.
Frank?
You know, the school boards control the salaries of all the employees. That's not Albany, that's the school boards. The school boards negotiate these typically every 3 years. What happens is, typical school board members are nice people. I find them very high in the virtue of charity. They're giving their time, but very, very weak in the virtues of fortitude, justice. I'm not going to say temperance, sometimes I mention all of them, and justice. Justice, prudence, and fortitude. They're very weak there. They're afraid to face up to the parents, the teachers, the other union people who come to these school board meetings and who account for 99% of the audience at a typical Board of Ed meeting.
But you say something like they're afraid to stand up to the parents. Give me an example.
Yeah, they're at a school board meeting. Port Washington, prime example. It's been like this forever all over the island. At a typical meeting, you might have anywhere from 30 to 100 people at a typical meeting. And the people who are there are 99 of them out of 100, teachers or other employees of the school district or PTA leaders who want more of this or more of that, who feel while their kids are in school, let's spend to the hilt because we want the absolute best. You know, we don't care what the cost is, whether it's cost effective. I mean, everyone wants the best for their children. But if something will result, let's say, in the average score in a math or a reading NAEP test going from 84.4 to 84.5, and it costs $10 million for an ordinary school, that's
Cost benefit.
foolish. It's
Right.
crazy.
Right.
It's not worth it. It's not fair to the taxpayers. They don't have that fortitude, that courage, or they don't lack the prudence. They lack the prudence to weigh these things properly, or they have no proper sense of justice between students, teachers, employees, and taxpayers. So the boards are caving in to these pressure groups. They cave in on the numbers of employees. I'll give you example after example how they've gone down. They have too many custodians. They have too many assistant principals. They have too many everything, too
So
many
many
guidance
specialists,
counselors.
psychologists, psychiatrists.
And a psychologist or a guidance counselor cost is typically $125,000 in a typical school with benefits. The average teacher is making well over $80,000. In my community, $87,000. 1/3 of our teachers made over $100,000 in 2005. 1/3 of our teachers. Unlike the city teachers, the poor city teachers, they need more money. How do we know? They don't have enough applicants for the jobs. In every Long Island community, it's been like this for 35 years, there are well over 100 applicants for every open position on average.
That's very telling right there.
That tells you don't have to raise the salaries, the health insurance, the health benefits. Teachers should be paying 20, 30% of the health insurance cost. Today, they typically pay 5 to 10%. That's a huge cost. Pensions are paid completely by the taxpayers. That's controlled by Albany. So the numbers of employees, the health insurance, the salary levels, those are all critical things from the taxpayer standpoint. The school board could introduce merit pay if they could negotiate that. That would help quality of education. You pay the best teacher more. You pay a high school teacher of science more than a kindergarten teacher. That makes sense. They don't do it. The kindergarten teacher gets as much as the high school chemistry teacher. It's ridiculous. So the school boards are in large ways culpable here, and it's because few people want to run for this position. Few people take the interest.
So you're saying then that the sense of justice that you were speaking of earlier is really in relationship to the fact that when the school boards act at any level financially, if they're not going to be diligent about examining the costs that make up that budget, that they're not paying enough respect to our senior citizens, people who are on a fixed income, people who are much more sensitive to tax increases. Would you agree with that, Pat?
100%, and it's because they don't have to. I mean, if you look at the political system of the way it is now, and I ran against a guy, and I'm not going to show you his name, he's a good guy, but the groups that support the candidates are well organized, they have a lot of money, and they sit across the table from the taxpayer. The only guy that seems to get it right now is County Executive Levy, who understands that he is the employee of the taxpayer. We're not a human resources organization in Suffolk County. Our ability to handle expenses is necessary.
I'm going to have we'll have to pause here for a second. We're having a discussion tonight about why our school taxes are out of control. We're now going to go to a public service announcement. We'll be right back.
When's Daddy coming home? Soon.
Other news, negotiations broke down again.
Daddy, Daddy! Cheers! Cheers, wait!
You got me.
So how was work?
Brutal. One meeting after another. I got a ton to do tonight.
At the end of the day, when the weight of the world is upon you,
Daddy doesn't want to play. Hey!
isn't it amazing
All right.
how the weight of their love can lift you up again?
Hey, you guys coming to dinner? Hey, guys.
For a free brochure about rediscovering the joy of your children, call 1-800-A-FAMILY and focus on the family.
Welcome back. Tonight's episode is Why Our School Tax is So Out of Control. Our guests tonight are Pat Byrne and Frank Russo, and we're going to pick it up where we left off. Pat, we were just discussing, so the sense of justice is really in relationship to all of our citizens, but in particular those who are on a fixed income, and you were commenting there.
I don't think the taxpayer yet is really organized enough really to defend themselves. I mean, most of the politicians, a fellow I ran against in the 12th LD out in Suffolk, put out one basically one periodical, and it had all of the various Suffolk unions that supported him on the back. Now, again, I'm not anti-union, but one of these days we're going to figure out that as elected leaders, we have an obligation to put the taxpayer before even employees of the local municipality. So that's been a big issue, and right now, again, the taxpayer is unfunded, they're unorganized, and that's kind of why we put together LIFER.
And greatly unaware to a great extent, which is part of the purpose of the program tonight.
Probably also believing that they're defeated before they even begin.
Good point.
There's a lot of work.
That it's so entrenched.
Yeah.
Frank, what would you say would be the main thing that you would like to see changed at the state level to address these issues?
Well, there's more than one thing at the state level because they're major culprits here. They decide on the pension requirement, whether or not we're going to have a defined benefit or defined contribution, which is what pretty much all of industry is now on, defined contribution where the employees pay. In the public school system, in some areas they pay for the first 10 years, but after that everything is paid for by the taxpayers completely, and even for the first 10 years they only pay, I think it's 3% at most in certain areas. So we've got to change that to a defined contribution where it's paid 50-50. We each pay the same amount, taxpayers and employees, or we encourage them to save. We should have just one school budget vote. That is the most nonsensical thing of all, to have 2 votes to, they get 2 shots at passing the budget. We'd actually
That is
like,
astounding.
We'd like to see 2 votes the other way, that in order to pass a budget, they have to pass it twice.
Oh, I love that.
We thought that would be fairer. In all honesty, that's absurd, just as absurd as the current system. There should be 1 vote, and that's it. And whatever, that would make the school boards be more reasonable. Right now, they come up with an inflated budget, and they say, what the heck, they're saying amongst themselves, what the heck, if it gets defeated, we put it up a second time, we'll lower it a little bit. So to make them more responsible, to put pressure on them to come up with a fair budget the first time, we should have just 1 vote. A second thing, if the contingency budget, that's the budget that takes effect when you defeat a budget twice. There's a formula. It includes 120% of inflation, plus enrollment changes, plus debt service. Debt service change I agree with completely, but it should be no inflation or 20% inflation. That, the taxpayers, in other words, are saying, gee, in our school district, we think the costs are out of control. We don't want it to be 100%. Maybe make it 20% of inflation, something like that. And maybe you can make an exception for some low-spending districts, which are in the rural areas. There are none of them in downstate New York. So 1 budget vote, redefine the contingency budget formula to lower the amount because the taxpayers have spoken. Change the day you elect the trustees. Instead of May, when 15% or 20% of the voters turn out, make it the general election day in November. Then you get a turnout of 50, 60%, and you'll get someone who's more reflective of what the community really wants. You'll see different kinds of people elected, not just the people who the PTAs want, or the teacher union wants, or the retired custodians and retired secretaries want. You get someone that's reflective of the whole community. So right now, it's not the case. Wick's Law, W-I-C-K-S, a law all the construction unions want. It mandates school districts, when they're constructing projects, adding school buildings, they cannot hire a general contractor, which would save statewide several hundred millions of dollars a year. Instead, they have to negotiate separately with plumbers, with electricians, with this union, with that union. And this makes the unions happy because it wastes time, takes longer for the project, there's more charges accrued, and it adds hundreds of millions of dollars, puts it into the construction union's pockets, and the taxpayers are being gypped. They're not getting anything. Instead, we could spend the same amount of money, the construction guys can make the same money, but we'll get 1.5 or 1.25 as many buildings constructed if we eliminate Wick's Law. But the politicians, every politician in Albany,
they're opposed to it.
They're not opposed to it. They all agree with it. They're terrified of the construction unions. Senator Salon just introduced a bill last year, but the union sat down with him. They told him what would happen if he dares to go ahead with it, and they drop it. These are a number of things that could be done at the state level.
And Pat, how would you respond to that? Those sound like very rational ideas, reasonable.
I agree.
And anything to add to?
One budget vote. I mean, that's a no-brainer. I mean,
well, when you think of it, we have 1 vote for everything else. I can't think of any other example of,
it's just not fair.
Double voting.
Yeah, it's not fair. The pension scenario, too, like Frank said, is a big problem. Again, not that I want to take things away from people, but as it is now, I just saw something interesting statistic the other day. For the first time since they started charting it, back in 1935, they actually have discovered that people now are saving less than 1/2 of 1% Okay, so if you think about people putting money in their IRA or 401k, it's not happening. There's no matches from the employer. They're not putting their own money in. So I put together a couple scenarios where I wanted to see a Tier 4 employee, kind of what they're contributing into their plan over their lifetime. And for a 32-year-old person right now starting at about $40,000, they're going to probably put in the neighborhood of $17,000, $20,000 of their own money in over their career. But when they start getting their money out, and again, it's going to be based on life expectancy, it could cost the taxpayer $750,000 to $1 million. And that's with good economic numbers. You start looking at a bad stock market for 5-6 years in a row, and again, life expectancy, we're going to run to the bottom of the barrel, and again, it's going to be a civil war. We don't want to have it get to that. Small adjustments right now, relatively painless, can probably fix the problem.
What adjustments would those be? What would you suggest?
Everybody needs to kick in probably a little bit more.
Okay. Currently, the teachers don't kick anything.
Typically nothing.
Well, they do,
10 years
for a Tier 4, you kick in about 3% of your salary for the first 10 years, and then it stops there. So again, it's not that anybody wants to take anything away. It's simply the economics that have changed. We're asking our children to compete with China and India now. And, 20, 30 years from now, they're not going to make adjustments. They're going to put us in little canoes and shoot us out into the water, and that's going to be it. So it's going to be painful if we don't get a handle on some of this stuff right now.
So Frank, you mentioned earlier some of the items that can occur at the state level in terms of how they impact local school budgets. Are there other items that you could list? I mean, because we've mentioned the unions, we've mentioned the political system, and I'm not always certain that translates down to the voters in terms of their incumbency, the people that they have a warm and fuzzy feeling for, but at the same time may not be truly representing their interests.
Oh, our state legislators most definitely are doing a horrendous job in both the Republican and Democrat parties, and it's the way the system is designed. It's another whole subject. It's a very seriously dysfunctional state. They've gerrymandered the districts, so assemblymen, senators are reelected, 99% of the time. But we need an education, which is, again, one of the education and health are the two biggest components in our state budget, Medicaid and education. Education's close to $50 billion now. If we introduce competition, into New York, by the way, the highest spending state on education after Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., by the way, spends more than any of the 50 states, maybe the exception of Alaska, and yet is below, is in 51st position on educational quality.
That is so glaring.
So money does not mean quality. New York is the second highest state in spending, and we are always in roughly the 25th position on quality. So it's not money that we need. What we need is competition. If we had competition, like they have now in Milwaukee and Cleveland, you will see changes starting. In other words, have a tuition tax credit program, or we had an educational tax incentive act, which our legislators would not approve.
But that's important stuff, because right now that's in discussion, that's in play here in New York State, and many of our incumbent elected officials are kowtowing to the teachers' unions across the state of New York. In particular, Randy Weingarten, who's the teachers' union in the city of New York, they are kowtowing to them, and they are not doing anything about this. And what the taxpayers need to know, what you really need to consider tonight, is that the private school system is at risk. That is about to collapse, trying to compete with the dysfunctional and far more expensive school system.
That's right.
And is unable to do so because we, the taxpayers, are actually funding the dysfunction.
Yeah, parents can't afford to pay tuition. Most parents, or many parents, can't afford to pay tuition of $4,000 or $5,000, and the school taxes. Now, the public schools don't spend $4,000 or $5,000 per pupil.
How much do
they spend? They spend $18,000 to $22,000. My district, it's $22,000. Some go above 20. The average is about $20,000 now in Nassau County per pupil. If we could give a tax credit of, say, $4,000 or $5,000 and encourage kids to go to non-public schools, the taxpayers would save $15,000, or share it with the public schools. Let the public schools keep $8,000 in their school system with no pupil, and give the other half back to the taxpayer. So everybody could win.
And that would be the competition you're talking about.
Plus quality would go up, Patty, as well, because the public schools then would say, my goodness, unless we really improve the quality, kids are going to leave us and go to these non-public schools.
Naturally, the parents would choose the private schools.
They would if they're not the public school's not performing. So competition would solve the quality issue and the cost issue.
Pat, you care to comment on the importance? My comment is really directed towards a lot of people misinterpret the argument about private schools and public schools, and the fact is that everyone in the state of New York benefits from the private school system. Whether you send a kid to school there or not, you get a benefit because you're not paying for someone's education.
Sure.
And when that's gone, you'll have to pick up the cost for that. Where do you stand on tax credits and tuition assistance?
I think choice is always good. I mean, I'm concerned about some of the poorer districts. You don't want to, give somebody a voucher, and that voucher isn't enough to get them into another school. But I think the biggest problem, and I can see it with our own organization, LIFER, and just politics in general, is where we're looking for things to change in Albany. The only way that's going to happen is we're going to have to get the correct makeup in Albany. And I've had conversations with a lot of people, again, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives. We're talking about property taxes being our number one issue. But when they're going into the voting booth, they're pulling their party lever regardless of what that person's view is on keeping them in their home. And I think that, forget party politics for a while, vote what's going to keep you in your house. Then we can debate other issues down the road if we can afford to do so.
And just looking at that, the poor district, like New York City, where we're spending now, we're going to have to come up with $11 billion to help New York City. Their schools are failing. Everyone knows it.
It's desperate.
It's desperate.
But that I fault Mayor Bloomberg for. He really was aggressive in going after that money, and the state caved into him because he's a dominant political figure with his affluence.
Well, here's the point. The Catholic schools in New York City are educating kids for $4,000 a child. Say even with subsidies, $5,000. The public schools are at 3 times that amount. So we could help. The poor people are the primary beneficiaries, quality-wise, if we could give them some kind of a tax credit or...
And the statistics on the Catholic schools are so much better.
They graduate at higher rates. That's right. They graduate at high rates. They don't fall out,
they go on to
drop out of the schools. They go on to college. So everyone benefits except the teacher unions, and they're fighting choice. They don't want any competition. That's their worst image.
And they are very powerful in the state, that's for sure.
We only have a minute left in our show, but I'd like to give you both the chance. What can the ordinary citizen, the viewers that are watching our show tonight, what can they do if they're concerned about excessive school taxes and how it's impacting their community? Pat, what would you recommend?
I would say get out and vote, organize, become part of an organization, and again, don't go in the booth and just pull the party line. Find out who the best candidate is. Good candidates on both sides of the aisle, independence, integrity. Find out those candidates that are going to help your wallet, because again, everything else is irrelevant.
Yeah, I agree with Pat completely, exactly what he said, and maybe consider forming an organization in your community to fight your school budget. Get affiliated with LIFER. We'll put up the address at the end. We're really getting our act together, I think, on Long Island. Upstate can consider doing the same thing.
Thank you both. You've been terrific guests tonight. Thank you, Patty. You've been watching the American Family Association Presents. Tonight's topic was why are school taxes out of control? Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Good night.